Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and I'm delighted to say joining me for this episode is my brother, Michael Sherlock.
Hi, Rachel.
You're a long-time listener and even longer-time brother.
I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so thrilled to have you on. A little bit of a peek behind the curtain. Me and Michael have been discussing having him on the podcast for quite a while. And unfortunately, every time we think of a topic that we want to talk about, it's usually like a 600-page book that we haven't quite aligned our readings of. So when one finishes, I'm like, oh, I have to reread it if we were going to talk about it. And I don't have time to read like a 600 to 800 page book for the podcast. So we've gone with a slightly different topic to bring you on. We're going to talk about a film.
Yes, it's easier to cover that time.
Yeah. And as I've mentioned in a couple of the episodes, I'm being very honest that my scheduling was a little bit off. So Michael has very kindly come in a little bit last minute when I'm inviting my friends, in this case my family, but Michael is also my friend, that I usually like to give them breathing space, a lot of time to prepare, pick something that they're super comfortable with. And instead I've just landed Michael in the deep end. We were actually at a funeral and I turned to him and said, would you mind coming on an episode of the podcast? So he has very kindly obliged to step in relatively last minute to do an episode.
But I think it's all in keeping with the kind of macabre appeal of the of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about the film Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which is a film Michael and I went to the cinema to see together and loved.
Oh, one of the best movies all time.
It's really up there for both of us. We really enjoyed it.
And hilarious.
Yeah.
In a good way. Good dark way.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is it's not necessarily a film that everyone will enjoy. It's certainly not P-rated, which is why Phoebe is not on this episode of the podcast.
We tried, but she was unwilling.
Yeah, we tried to convince her to watch it with us when we were preparing for this episode, but nothing doing. And that is because it is quite a violent film. It's got a lot of dark themes. It's got a lot of curse words. It has a lot of, intense topics, and especially it's quite explicitly violent. Which is the kind of movie the Sherlock family watches, I guess. But yeah, and I think just to highlight for this episode of the podcast, I know some of my listeners listen with their family or their little kids around. Obviously, we will not be replicating the curse words or the expletives in the film. The bits that we quote, we won't be quoting anything like that. But it is a film with a lot of dark themes. And there's discussion of rape, and there's discussion of violence and murder and even suicide. So obviously I just want to give a heads up that while we'll keep the content of the language clean, the themes themselves will be quite dark. So it mightn't necessarily be one to listen to with little kids in earshot. But I think maybe the first thing that we should do is just kind of set the background for why we want to talk about this film and why it's relevant for an episode of Risking Enchantment. And so to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about a genre of literature in particular called Southern Gothic, which is this strain of literature. It's from the American South and originates kind of around the early 1800s. I think I was sort of surprised when I looked it up to hear that the first big name in it was Edgar Allan Poe. I hadn't really considered him as part of that. But there's other famous writers in this genre. William Faulkner, of course, Tennessee Williams, Carson McCullers, and Flannery O'Connor, our favourite.
Absolutely. Rachel has introduced me to her and I've been devouring her books ever since.
Yeah, I think you gave me her collection of letters for my birthday and then immediately borrowed it back off me to read.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. So we both love Flannery O'Connor, and she's going to be kind of the main perspective through which we're looking at this film. If it's not a genre that you know a lot about, it's kind of characterized by the presence of irrational or horrific transgressive thoughts and desires and impulses. There's a kind of grotesque nature to it between the characters and the humor, and there's this sort of kind of sense of being angst-ridden or alienated. There's like a sense of not being integrated with the place that you're in some ways very literally, with issues of race and things like that. And in some ways it kind of boils down to the idea that you've got this idyllic pastoral agrarian community that rests on these sort of repressed historical realities of racism and slavery and patriarchy, and just generally these sort of sinister side to an isolated community.
Interestingly, she actually does portray an awful lot of religion negatively, in the sense that the overzealous of the kind of the pastors and the prophets kind of, and you can see that in her works, like The Violent Bear Away and even Wise Blood, these kind of themes of unbound religious fanaticism.
Yeah, the Bible Belt element to it, and yes. Even in, it's funny, obviously the film is not a Flannery O'Connor work, but one of the characters is called Jason Dixon, which is kind of like an obvious play on the Mason-Dixon line. And so you've got this sense of the overbearing Bible Belt and issues of like integration in terms of the different communities there. So yeah, absolutely. And you're right, you've actually probably read more of Flannery's stories than me. I haven't actually delved into her novels. I've read some of her collections of short stories. But yeah, so you've got maybe a deeper perspective on what she's saying about religion, which again is a very unexpected perspective from that time, from that era, in that place.
Yes, I think, well, as you said once, like getting to read her letters, you really get to know her. I mean, I hadn't read as many of the letters, and so when I was reading the novels, I would have said that she was maybe antagonistic towards religion. But then there's always that underhand of grace that kind of tries to redeem, or this kind of unseen force from without, trying to guide the characters onto the right path. And usually it's they're struggling against the hand, their true nature, their true characters reflected at the last moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And yeah, she's all about those moments of transcendental grace that, like, in the midst of what's often quite brutal stories or unsettling, they're not, if you're looking for cozy, if you're looking for reassuring, don't read Flannery O'Connor. They're all very weird and unsettling. And I think one of the things that makes her so interesting as a writer in that time and place is the fact that she's Catholic, and so she's looking at this religiosity, which I think a lot of people of her demographic were seeing very positively, because, you know, as a Protestant, seeing this sort of booming Protestant culture, but she was seeing it from a different perspective and seeing how it was in some ways, at least from her perspective, dislocated from its foundational truth in the Catholic Church, and so how it's sort of spinning off, like you said, in these mad directions, or with these sort of individual prophets speaking individual truths and refounding of their own churches, and that she sees the ways that religion isn't living up to its expectations. And I think the other thing that is really telling about her is that as much as she is criticizing or seeing the problems of the religiosity of the age and place that she's in, the thing that is actually interesting is that in some ways she does see the positives of having a community that still recognizes that Christ has some part in that. And so she has this line, it's in her series of essays in the book Mysteries and Manners, where she says, "I think it's safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centred, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner, who isn't convinced of it, is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. Ghosts can be very fierce and instructive. They cast strange shadows, particularly in our literature." Which is such a beautiful way to put it, that Christ-hauntedness of the community that she's in, that it is this thing that's lingering in the back of people's minds, even when they're not really sure what to do with it.
She has another quote, and I'm sorry I don't have it written down, but it's of kind of the chasing after this Christ-like figure darting through the woods, and then suddenly, upon catching him, or rather you discover he catches you, and then it's over because you're lost in the wildness of the Zila Sea. So it's
she has that ability to combine what I think a lot of us, especially in a very like middle class bourgeois perspective, that we're looking at the world and saying, well, you know, religion makes me feel good and I do nice things and I'm kind. And she's always talking about faith in this very disturbing and uncomfortable way, but saying that that's actually how we should be interacting with it. And so in some ways she's a little like Chesterton in the way she flips things on their head. But she's such a vivid writer, and I think the way that she does that is very visually appealing. And so I think it's not that surprising that she has been quite as substantial. She has, you know, she casts her own shadow over modern filmmaking. And as I recall, I think they actually made some films of her books when they were written. I believe there was a TV version of A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which I don't think she thought overly highly of, although I think she had to present it as well, and she hated seeing herself on television. But that, I think instantly it was the type of thing that people wanted to see presented visually. And so it's sort of not surprising to me that she has this influence, this shadow that she casts over a lot of filmmakers, and especially ones that are sort of very notorious for their use of violence, because she uses violence to such effect and it's very deliberate. And we're going to come back to it later in the episode to talk about why the violence is important. But she absolutely uses violence as the means to bring about the moment of grace and redemption in her stories, which, like I said, I think is such an interesting idea for filmmakers that they kind of latch onto it. So I know she's been explicitly stated as like an influence on Quentin Tarantino, on the Coen brothers, who have their own kind of shadow in Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. There is almost like a continuation from their own film Fargo, with Frances McDormand as the main actress, that like this as this main figure in a sort of violent, quirky film. So yeah, the Coen brothers, and she's very explicitly referenced in Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. The film almost starts, there's like a very short sequence of shots of the billboards in question, empty and derelict, and then almost the first shot after that is of this character, Red Welby, who is the advertising agent for the town, who owns the billboards, which are then put in play. We're going to give a summary of the story, so don't worry, but he's holding and reading a copy of A Good Man Is Hard to Find. So the film absolutely begins with this framing that you're watching a story that is fundamentally framed by the Flannery O'Connor perspective of the American South, of grace, of violence, of all of these things. And so I think that's why it's so interesting to talk about this film and the ways in which it does that, and the ways potentially in which it doesn't achieve its aims, in terms of, if you're looking at it from a Flannery O'Connor perspective, that it has its forthright stating, we're going to be talking about grace and redemption and violence at the very start of this, which is an interesting premise for what is essentially a modern secular film.
Yes.
Before we get into the discussion fully, I suppose the first thing to do is just set up a little bit about Martin McDonagh, who is the kind of creator of this film. And he's a British-Irish playwright. He's a screenwriter and producer, and he's born in London. But he has written a series of plays that are based in Ireland that have been very critically acclaimed. There's The Beauty Queen of Leenane, there's The Cripple of Inishmaan. There's more than that in the series. There's quite a few of them. And he's also directed a series of dark comedy films, two of which starring Irish actor Colin Farrell. The first one was In Bruges, and the second one was Seven Psychopaths. And then this is kind of his third big film, Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. So he's quite interesting in that he comes from a Catholic background. He is a lapsed Catholic, and he has what me and Michael will very easily identify from our Irish experiences, a quite antagonistic approach to the church. From this lapsed Catholic background, it is quite recognisable in Irish society, at least. And in the film Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, he has this, it's a very powerful moment, but it is I would say, somewhat out of place, where a Catholic priest is talking to the main character and she gets a monologue kind of dressing him down about the sex abuse scandals in the church. And, you know, I think there was even a quote where Martin McDonagh said, oh, it was an opportunity to throw another institution under the bus, because the film is a lot about the kind of corruption in the police force. So it was like, well, here's another thing I want to complain about. And yet, at the same time, I think he is still wrestling with it. Like, that Christ haunted is something that's relevant to him. And his film In Bruges has an important plot point about confession. And it's interesting that he, you know, in some ways, he just can't let it go, even when he's railing against it. It's not something he feels like he can just move past. It is always kind of lingering in his work. And in some ways, I find it's kind of similar. His long-term girlfriend, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, is famous for creating Fleabag, and that had in its last season, which I haven't seen, but I do know a lot about, which is the hot priest as the moral conflict of that season, and this sort of in some ways quite endearing view of Catholicism in that season. But probably more importantly, Martin's brother John Michael McDonagh was the one who directed Calvary, and who he said that was an attempt to tell a good story about a priest to go along with all of the bad ones. So it's kind of interesting that there is a sense of it, Catholicism being this backdrop around a lot of the creative works hanging around him. And obviously you can't just say, just because his brother feels one way, he feels the same way. You know, even Michael and I don't have the same opinion on everything. But yeah, so it is kind of an interesting element to it. So I think maybe, Michael, you're going to introduce the film a little bit to us if you haven't seen it, or if you just need a reminder. It came out a couple of years ago, and there will be mild spoilers. We will try and avoid some of the major sort of plot twisty bits in it, but there's not really that much. It's not necessarily like a plot twist kind of film, so it's worth explaining.
Yes. So in the fictional town of Ebbing, Missouri, Mildred Hayes is grieving over the rape and murder of her teenage daughter Angela 7 months earlier. Angry over the lack of progress in the investigation, Mildred rents 3 disused billboards near her home and posts on them, "Raped while dying, and still no arrests. How come, Chief Willoughby?" The billboards upset many people, including Chief Willoughby and the racist alcoholic police officer, Jason Dixon. These billboards act as a catalyst for the spate of action and violence across the town. We see Mildred's continual battle with her own grief and her desire for justice. But the character with the most development across the film is Dixon, who undergoes trials, a changing perspective, and potentially a shot at some kind of redemption.
So yeah, that's our introduction to the story. As you can see, Michael pointed out to me before this that, you know, we are telling you where the characters end up, but we are going to skip some of the beats that are maybe the more unexpected beats in the story. But yeah, this trajectory of redemption is really important to the way that we're discussing this film. I think it was a really highly acclaimed film. It sort of came out, I think it was quite a box office success. We certainly saw it in the cinema.
Yes. And there was a good hype in it.
Yeah, I think it was kind of highly anticipated. And it got a lot of awards. And the main characters were all nominated and then won their respective categories. I think actually Woody Harrelson, who plays Chief Willoughby, was up against Sam Rockwell, who plays Jason Dixon. So only one of them could win that. But Sam Rockwell and Frances McDormand both won the Oscar for their respective roles. But it wasn't without controversy. I think it came at a time where there was a lot of discussion, and there continues to be a lot of discussion about the portrayal of people of colour in films. And there was people who felt kind of uncomfortable with it because the main trajectory of the story is about this racist cop who gets a kind of hero story, and there was a sense of that not being maybe the story that people wanted to hear at that moment. And there is I would say a sense of the black characters in the story having a kind of sideline. They do exist, but they are very much not what the story is about. They don't get their own hero moment.
Yeah, a lot of the racism is off scene. So in the sense that it's very much present in the sense that it's referenced, but we don't see an awful lot of it happening. So, for example, a black woman is arrested, but none of that arrest is ever seen. We just simply know that we were introduced to her. We're then told that she's arrested, and then we are later reintroduced to her after she's released from prison and wrongfully imprisoned at that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. So we know it's happening. It's just not happening in front of us. And I think there is a sense in which if you're going to bring up racism in your story, that it's kind of, you might want to actually make sure that you really tell that story as opposed to just... I think what he is doing well is just showing how ubiquitous it is in that particular context, or that in certain situations like that. I think from my own perspective, and in terms of talking about it on the podcast, I always feel like when I'm coming up to these discussions that, you know, as an Irish person, I'm white, I don't have a lot of experience with this. It's not something like, you know, the experience of racism in the American South is not something that I have any kind of great shakes about. But equally, I think it's maybe kind of telling that Martin McDonagh, who created the film, is also from a similar kind of, not totally the same perspective as me, but in a kind of similar space. And so it almost feels like maybe he just wasn't quite equipped to tell that kind of story, that he didn't quite know what he was getting into when he was taking it on. And in the same way, like I said, he has this scene with this Catholic priest, and I did look it up. Missouri has a population of about 16% Catholics, which isn't nothing. That is like a notable portion of the population. But equally, like at one point the priest says, I've had, you know, dozens of people have come up to me and told me that they don't agree with your billboards, Mildred. And you're kind of like, this is a very small town in rural Missouri. How many Catholics do you have? It just feels a little bit like he was writing from a different point of view and putting it kind of into the American South. I think it was funny. I saw one description which said that maybe the film would have worked better if it was called Three Billboards Outside Kilkenny, which is actually where me and Michael are from. So.
Yes. And too, I suppose the defence there, while it does seem maybe more like an Irish setting set in the Midwest, having it in that location, it adds to the isolation, because I think that's one of the things that the film deals with grief, with Mildred's loss of her daughter. And she very much creates this cloak of being isolated and keeping people away from her. And so when you see this town, like the billboards are on a kind of a dirt track really, to the motorway which bypasses the town. So it kind of suggests and says who's going to see these billboards. So it suggests that, you know, it's a bypass, so all the traffic, nobody comes to this town. It's a backwater effectively, and what's more, the townspeople themselves don't want to connect with the rest of the world. It's a disused road that they go down. So and that's what I think that was kind of his purpose for writing, and then as well alluding to the Flannery O'Connor, the kind of some of the inspiration for telling this really raw, gritty, grotesque story. That's the reason for setting it. And then, as you said, he didn't feel well equipped for how to write about race relations, and so kind of leaves that happening offset. Though I suppose again in some kind of defence as well, some of that in the example that I've given, whereby you have the black woman being wrongfully arrested, that is thrown at Mildred as an unexpected surprise, whereby she's kind of blindsided with that, and so it kind of alludes to, you know, that the audience is also kind of, well, we are expecting something bad to have happened. That's the reveal. So again, it utilizes an awareness of where he's weak, and then trying to incorporate that into the storytelling, and so that it actually makes it kind of a positive or plausible narrative.
Yeah. And I think for our perspective, we really enjoyed the film. I think it is just worth bringing up that some people did find that to be an issue, which I think is a legitimate reading of the film.
Absolutely. When you raise something up into, like, you know, and as Mildred constantly reboots the police as being racist and torturing black people, and we actually get very little first-hand evidence for the
Yeah, I think even the Chief Willoughby kind of references it, or even the racist character Jason Dixon kind of essentially admits to it himself. So it's not so much a question of whether it is happening, it's just that we're not quite seeing it in front of us. And I think it's interesting, like we're saying, about the way that Flannery O'Connor approaches it, because she has her own critics in terms of how she deals with race, although I think for the most part, I think a lot of people really reckon with the fact that she's writing characters that are real characters, and that includes black characters. She doesn't just use them as kind of symbols, or, you know, I think a lot of the times they were in that era, especially from white writers, they were reduced down to stereotypes. I have a quote here from the Hilton Als, who wrote in the New Yorker about the ways that O'Connor's work confronted and confounded the norms of her readers, that they were not symbols defined in opposition to whiteness. They were living people who were, physically at least, on the periphery of O'Connor's own world. She didn't use them as vessels for sympathy or scorn. She simply and complexly drew from life. And that life was often quite a racist society. And so it's interesting trying to draw out her own perspectives and what she's writing about and trying to render realistically. But it's certainly nuanced. But I think the point is though, at the very least, she's writing from within that society. And whereas, as we pointed out, MacDonagh's maybe standing outside that. But like you said, Michael, I think what's important is that he is very explicitly trying to write a Flannery O'Connor story. And so it has to be set in the American South for that to happen. Like, I just don't think you can really write such an obviously Flannery O'Connor story. You could maybe take her principles and apply them somewhere else. But if you're trying to visually communicate that you're telling a Flannery O'Connor story, the absolute number one thing you have to do is set it in the American South. So with all of that preamble, I think maybe we should turn to that lengthy preamble. I think we should turn to the actual themes and what makes us kind of interested in this story. And for me, the two main characters are Mildred Hayes, this grieving mother, and Jason Dixon, this buffoonish cop who then gets a kind of shot at redemption. But if we're looking at Mildred, I would say her primary motivation, and it's quite in some ways like a biblical motivation, is this question of justice, that she's really searching for justice. And she's acting out a lot in quite explicitly in violence as the movie goes on, because she's looking for earthly justice. And while absolutely we would agree that, our institutions of justice are there to enact as much justice on earth as we can and seek out those who have perpetrated awful crimes, such as the one that her daughter suffered, there is a sense that she's coming up against a brick wall and she doesn't really know what to do about it, because she doesn't have the ability to hope for a sense of divine justice, that even if she fails in this life to bring about justice for her daughter, that there will be some kind of justice. Like at one point she sees a deer that kind of comes towards her as she's actually tending some flowers around these billboards that she's bought, and she's talking to this deer, and she says that she sort of starts giving a reflection on her perspective of the world, and she says that, is it just that there ain't no God and the whole world's empty and it doesn't matter what we do to each other? I sure hope not. But she's really stuck at that, I sure hope not, that she can't quite bring herself to believe in there being more. And so she really has to seek out justice.
Yes, so I think kind of with that, I sure hope not, well, she says it, and it's all but words, in a sense that everything that she does is dependent on, and we see this kind of escalate and build, whereby the billboards start to mean more and more to her than actually even achieving the justice that's being sought. Well, maybe not to the extent of the justice that's being sought, but even when the billboards' ends have been met, in the sense that they have been brought awareness of this crime to the public at large, the police have relaunched a kind of a renewed investigation into the piece. Even still, she cares for these billboards. It's almost like headstones for her, or kind of that imagery of her bringing flowers and plotting them underneath the billboards. She's kind of cultivating these things and hoping that something good will come from it, even though everything that has actually been spurred from these billboards has been conflict and negative violence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You're so right there. And that, yeah, they kind of become like a totem for her as she's on this quest, that if she can just keep these billboards going for long enough, something good will happen. She's like clinging to that. And you know, it's interesting because the film definitely portrays the police force as being broken or ineffective, that like, you know, you see the people it's comprised of, I don't really think you would have a lot of confidence in them. And yet when Chief Willoughby comes to her and kind of asks her why she's set up these billboards, specifically accusing him, you know, how come Chief Willoughby, like the buck stops with him, and he gives her the list of things that they have done, and that, you know, on some level there is a sense that they did do their job. There just wasn't a lot to go on. There weren't any witnesses. The last person to see her daughter alive was her mother, Mildred. And they have DNA, but they have no one to check it against. And so, you know, there's just... they have reached a dead end. It wasn't necessarily that I think you can always feel that, like, if you could take it on as personally as a mother, that they would find more. But on some level, they have just tried and reached a dead end, that there isn't anything more to do.
And I think there's another point there whereby that's not enough for Mildred, and for her, every man is guilty pretty much until she is found the murderer of her daughter, whereby she says that she would have every man DNA profiled at birth, and that, you know, so that if such a case ever arose, that we'd be able to compare and contrast it. So this view of every man is guilty until and has the potential to be guilty, and that's where she trying to sate that desire for justice, that we need to get round up everybody and get them tested so that we can get an answer to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the guilty until proven innocent, and we will hold this over your head for your entire life. And, you know, you can absolutely sympathize with her. It's such a horrific story, and, you know, it's not beyond the realms of believability. This is sadly the story of people in the world, and of many people, in fact. But that, I think, it is this absolutely blistering quest for justice. It eviscerates all of her other virtues in some ways. Like me and Michael have talked a lot about how she has another son in the film, and he's so clearly struggling and so clearly neglected, at least emotionally, by her, because she's on this quest for vengeance.
And even opposite in the sense that the small bit of sanity that he does get from kind of like trying to lose himself at school and stuff like that, suddenly he can't even do that, whereby the whole town is against her and against these billboards. And as he says in the film, like, you know, the 13 seconds that he's not thinking about what happened to his sister, she stuck up signposts to remind him that things, and even then we had learned that he had tried to keep the details of her final moments hidden from himself. She had given him the death report and he hadn't read it, and then she goes and posts it up on the billboard so that the whole town knows, and subsequently he knows as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the film kind of does have a slightly, I don't know, ambivalent approach to the use of violence. Like, is it justified or is it not justified? It kind of, in some ways, steps back and doesn't take a position. But I thought it was interesting, like at one point she's really reached a dead end and she's sitting on the edge of her bed in her nightgown and her fluffy bunny slippers, and she starts like wiggling her toes and speaking through them, and she essentially has the bunnies say, "What should we do? Crucify them." You know, that like this this chant that we have from our Easter liturgy is spoken through the words of her fluffy bunny slippers. That there's this kind of deeply comic but also dark portrayal of how we can't enact our own justice. Like, she's trying so hard and she's doing everything she can to bring up some modicum of justice in this world, and it's interesting from a Catholic perspective, we just have to at some point let go and say that pure justice will not be possible in this world, and that we can hope for some kind of justice but not full justice.
Yeah, I think you said there that the film projects maybe kind of a blank perspective on violence, or kind of doesn't come down one way or the other. I would actually say that it probably has nearly a pro appeal of violence. Definitely when we see Mildred extracting her violence on others, it can be very cathartic in the sense that we can see her struggle. We know the horrors that she's had to endure and what her daughter had to endure, and so kind of getting this release of endorphins and at this kind of getting back at the system that seems to be wanting to close in around them and say no, shut up, and and grieve, I suppose.
Grieve quietly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we see that kind of very clearly in kind of things like after the billboards go up, there's one of the townspeople, the dentist, is very vocal against her. And when she goes to visit the dentist, he then tries to turn the drill on her, and she manages to overcome him and drill a hole in him in return. And that scene is very much, very intense, whereby we first of all think she's helpless in the dentist's chair, and kind of what is he going to do to try and things, and then when she's able to turn the drill on him, it's we get that release, and it's like, yeah, you go, girl. But then, as I said, so we're kind of engaging in this violence, and we starting to invest more and more in the story and in the billboards ourselves. We are drawn on and spurred to, yes, I would totally do that same action or that violence, so much so that it rises to a climax. And then I suppose kind of the climax is linked with our other character of Dixon. But from that point on, we then start to see more and more of the consequences of that violence and of the collateral damage that then is reaped. And that's when we start to pull away. And while there is maybe some cathartic, it's never as clear as it's more, we can never fully shake or excuse the rationale for the violence.
Yeah, it does start to devolve, and she starts to get less directed in what she's doing, and ultimately we find out that some of the things she thinks that she has this big act of violence where she essentially burns down a building in retaliation against someone burning down her billboards. And it turns out she got it wrong as to who burnt down the billboards, things like that she's not even aiming in the right direction anymore. I have a quote here from a website called Transpositions, which had quite a good article on hope in the film. And the article says, the billboards proved to be an empty symbol, inspiring outrage and conversation, but accomplishing nothing of value. And I think that's a kind of interesting point to jump off of, which is that, they do inspire some action. And actually, we're about to look to Dixon, and in some ways he gets this redemptive arc, but it only kind of happens because she starts on this road, or maybe not. Like there's this character of the Chief Bill Willoughby who has this kind of emotional role in the film, and maybe it's just coming from him, or like it's not totally clear where the sparks of his redemptive action comes from. But the billboards in some ways also totally fail, that they're not actually going to achieve anything except make Mildred more of an outcast than she is, and to vent her spleen.
Yes, I think I suppose it depends on this wonderful question of like, is there a God or whatever, but from what the film lays out, nothing good comes from the billboards. It just simply catalyzes violence and anger, and as you said, kind of ostracizes Mildred from the rest of the community. However, even in that dire moment, and when all of despite, because it was good that she wanted good to come from them, the way, even though it may not have been a good action, even in that calamity of situations, Grace acts, and from that it can interweave and kind of, as I said, it bring Dixon to this point of potential redemption, despite the negative consequences, or maybe even, as you were saying, kind of because of the negative consequences of being catalyzed by those billboards.
Yeah, and I think the film also somewhat hints that she is wrestling with moments of grace in her own life, that she may be offered graces, that she is to a certain extent responding to, but also to a certain extent shutting down in her quest. Like, there was a really great article from Word on Fire by Father Damien Ferencz where he really highlights how there's actually a moment in the film which is almost like a mirror image of a moment in Flannery O'Connor's probably her most famous story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is about a family that goes on a road trip and is then they hear stories about this serial killer character called the Misfit, and eventually they run into him and have this fatal encounter. But it's told through the perspective of this grandmother who's very fussy and all up in her own thoughts and is kind of very self-preoccupied. And then it's only at the end when she has a gun in her face that she actually really encounters the humanity of another person. It's just that person happens to be the man holding a gun to her face. And so O'Connor is kind of suggesting that this terrible thing is actually the only thing that's actually going to break through this old woman's self-preoccupation. And so the moment that Father Damien Ferencz pulls out for his article is that Mildred is having this heated argument with Chief Willoughby, and he has an illness which everyone kind of knows about but isn't really talking about. And so as they're talking, he suddenly violently coughs blood in her face. And it the acting is so good because she instantly, there's no beat between her having this kind of moment of shock and her instantly responding with love and compassion and worry that she instantly wants to mother him.
For the man that she's called out on these billboards as responsible for not arresting anyone for her daughter's death.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll just read out a quote from it here. Willoughby sprays blood all over her face. Mildred immediately gets up from her chair and embraces Willoughby and calls him my baby. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this scene was inspired by McDonagh's reading of A Good Man is Hard to Find, specifically the scene where the grandmother reaches out to the misfit while saying, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." In both narratives, it is a moment of grace when the other is recognised as a fellow human being and not merely as a competitor. In the Three Billboards, it's our first inclination that there's something beyond grief and anger for Mildred and for all who are grieving.
Yeah, I hadn't picked up on that "my baby" line.
Exactly, it's an incredible slip, but it just makes so much sense there.
Yeah, and so there's these occasional moments where you actually see what feels like the true Mildred breaking through, but she just can't let it go. And in some ways, I don't necessarily know what she's supposed to do because she has a right to fight for her justice, but she is lashing out in these progressively more violent ways and trying to cast particular people in the role of, like you said, that Willoughby is responsible because he is the chief. And, there is a logic to it. He is the chief of police. It is his problem. But at the same point, like we said, it isn't that they haven't tried at the same point. And I think it is interesting that she knows he's very ill and potentially dying, and she kind of says that that's no excuse. And I'm kind of on her side in that respect, that you can't just say, oh, well, he's having a hard time, so you can't expect him to do his job. That there is a sense that you are in the role of an enactor of justice, and you are the person that I have to appeal to. And as much as I might sympathize with you, that this is still who I'm asking for, but it's almost because the real person she wants to ask for is God, and she can only go so far up the chain until she hits the chief of police, and she doesn't know who to go above that,
That's a great point.
And yeah, just to go back to that article on the transpositions on hope, I think he makes a really good point, which is that inability to reach for God is a more unsettling tone to Flannery's stories are so unsettling, I almost don't want to say that, but it is a less morally clear tone for the film. So the article says, O'Connor's Catholicism offers one answer to the question of why. Suffering has greater significance beyond the individual. O'Connor sees and portrays a world full of broken people longing for the redemption that Christ offers. As a lapsed Catholic, McDonagh offers a less comforting, though perhaps more relatable answer. People often suffer for no reason at all, and their only real recourse is more violence. When given clarity through tragedy, Mildred Hayes sees nothing but emptiness. If O'Connor portrays a Christ-haunted South, McDonagh provides a South haunted by a quickly fading fiction of meaning. One can almost feel McDonagh's personal uncertainty bleed through the words of Mildred Hayes. Is this the way the world truly is? I hope not.
Yeah, I think that's a bit too critical, or in the sense that maybe kind of too straight cut, in the sense that his world doesn't have any reference to God. For me, when I was watching it, like, I could see the hand of God moving through every scene, or not every scene, but looking back, you can see where the movements of grace and how it's able to slip between all these very harsh defenses, and I think where what O'Connor does is that while he's not like, he's not McDonagh isn't not like O'Connor, whereby he doesn't explicitly call upon God, or he doesn't directly allude to it. He presents a blank canvas so that his audience brings whatever is with them. You know, it says, for me, with my Catholicism, I can then view it and I can see it. Whereas I think for those, and we've seen it in the criticisms, that where they don't actually have that kind of ability to read the scenarios, they struggle very much with trying to understand what's happened on screen.
And I think it's also worth pointing out, I think you're absolutely right. And in some ways, I'd say a lot of people who don't know who Flannery O'Connor is, if they read her work, like you said, you felt that she was more critical of religion. Because when we say that McDonagh is not being explicit in the way that he appeals to Christ, that almost suggests that Flannery O'Connor's books are always like, and then God intervened and grace happened. And they're not like that at all. It's just that when you know that she's a Catholic, when you read it, you go, I know what's happening there. And so in some ways, you're kind of reading back into something the wrong way, which is to say that we know exactly what McDonagh was trying to say, and reading it that way. I kind of agree with you. And because also a lot of his imagery is very much of that classic type. Like, there's so much purging fire in this film that there are so many fires and baptisms by fire and all of these like very I would say on the nose, except that they don't feel like really obvious when you're watching it, like, oh, here comes the fire imagery. But when you're taking the movie seriously and thinking about it, it suddenly comes up again and again. Oh yeah, there was that moment where everything was on fire and a character changed.
That's actually, nearly beat for beat. I've recently just re-listened to Flannery O'Connor's The Violent Bear It Away. And like that, in all these key moments, she has the main character burn stuff down. And it's like, I was like, this is Three Billboards. And like that, just kind of this imagery of fire is very much intertwined between both Flannery's own works and in the Three Billboards.
Yeah. I think it was in the Word on Fire article, they also referenced like the three billboards being a little like the three crosses on Calvary. That, yeah, there's at the very least, it's kind of, it's telling that it's three billboards, that this theologically significant number.
But even like explicitly in the film, we are told that this all happens at Easter. You have Willoughby interrupted his Easter meal with the news that these billboards have gone up.
Yeah, and as I said, the movie opens with this shot of Red Welby, the advertising agent, reading The Good Man Is Hard to Find. And it's the first kind of scene with dialogue is then Mildred comes into the room and says, I want to rent these three billboards, and has a very funny exchange about what she can and can't say on the billboards. But she then asks, okay, if I pay for it now, when will they be up? And he goes, 2 weeks time, so that'll be Easter Sunday. And she goes, that's perfect. That there's this really explicit sense that this is happening at Easter. We want you to know this is happening at Easter.
This is going to be her resurrection, or she's going to kind of have her hope fulfilled.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of talking about trials by fire and redemption, we should maybe turn to the character of Jason Dixon, who is this, I will say, he's a very unlikable character. He's a racist cop. I will say I'm a huge Sam Rockwell fan. So when he comes on screen, I know he's a terrible person, but I already instinctively kind of like him.
Well, I hadn't actually seen much of his previous work.
Well, I will say, one sec, Michael, I'm about to, because I forgot to tell you this earlier. You have seen one film that you really like with him in it, and it is Galaxy Quest.
Oh, amazing. Okay, yes. I love his previous work. But when you were saying earlier, actually, of kind of he was up against Woody Harris for Best Supporting Actor, I was like, oh no, he should have got it. But because he really does make himself so endearing. Well, first for so repellent and so things, but then his acting and his as we are brought along the journey with him, I think we're also redeemed, whereby the kind of when we see the bad elements in him that could be reflected in us, we too then can also undergo this moment of grace.
Yeah, he is a really interesting character. He's I just think Sam Rockwell is a great actor. I think it was in the last episode of the podcast that I recommended a film he's currently in called See How They Run, but he's just so compelling and interesting. But the character is in some ways your kind of obvious corrupt, lazy, racist cop, but he's also they always weave more nuance through him. He is quite childish. He's sitting at his desk reading like comic books, and he is very obvious, at least to me, a character in search of a father, that he feels like a kid stuck in his childish ways,
and yet he listens to classical music.
There are nuances to it.
Yeah, and I love that about it. Again, you don't just simply have just one shade of this is the racist cop. No, you have, yes, he has father issues. Yes, he has a kind of a very controlling mother. You have this kind of desire for classical music. You've got
the comic books, the kind of escapism of that. Yeah.
And all of this kind of combines into this very simplistic and yet complex character.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting how the film really does show how much of his kind of racist ideas come from his mother, and how he's not even particularly comfortable with his mother and what she thinks, and he lives with her still, and it's kind of a difficult relationship that they have, and that he isn't just this character that comes out of an evil cloud and is evil, that he's a lot more human than that, and he's so funny in it as well.
Yeah, we learn that a lot of the torturing that he does is actually on the advice of his mother as well.
Absolutely. That she is this really kind of malign influence on him, and yet he's quite tender with her as well, which is it's just a much better portrayal of a character than just saying he has one attribute and that's the only thing of interest about him. And so as the story goes on, he's inspired by some of the words of Chief Willoughby and various actions to yearn to do some good in the world. He gets caught in a massive fire. He actually saves the file of Angela Hayes's murder, like the notes and all the kind of the bundle of papers. He saves that from a fire.
With his sacrifice, as I said, his own life nearly to get that.
He's literally on fire, and yet he's protecting the pages. Yeah, which I think is really it's a really touching moment. And so this comes at a crisis point, because it comes right after him
doing the most heinous act. And I think this act that we're going to say is whereby he throws a person out a window, and you are just absolutely, this person has done nothing of any harm directly to him and things. He may have had some hand in events, but he definitely was not deserving of this brutal, very violent outburst. And it's at that point that when all the violence that I've kind of spoken about, where we were maybe making excuses for the Mildred's violent outbursts and that there was cathartic with it, we're just ripped of any sort of excuse, and we just realize that, oh no, wait, this has gone way too far, and real lives are seriously being maimed in this action. And that then brings to the kind of the moment of grace for Dixon, whereby he gets, we said he was lit on fire, and so he's severely burnt and head to toe in bandages, and he's wheeled into the recovery ward as the same man who he's thrown out the window. And this amazing scene as tears start to flow down his eyes, and he realizes who he is sharing the ward with, and then the guy who was thrown out the window is later to cop on as to who this other person is.
Yeah, he doesn't recognize him through the bandages.
And so we suddenly realize, oh wait, he is now completely in control of the situation. Like, he can do whatever he wants to this man in bandages, the burnt victim, his perpetrator.
Yeah.
And he chooses to give him mercy, and not only that, but starts to serve him, whereby he offers him orange juice to drink, and makes it as easy as possible for him to drink and to suit him. And just that, you can see him just trying to accept that mercy is just one of the most powerful scenes in cinema that I've ever seen.
I really love it. I agree. It's such a... I love the movie for the fact that the story brings you to that point where you get to see that moment of grace. Like you said, that it's not just mercy, that he forgives him, but that he immediately serves him, and serves him through both emotional and physical pain. Like, this man who he's put in the hospital is still pretty severely...
Oh, the both of them are like mummies with the amount of bandages that are decorating them.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet he staggers over and gives him this glass of orange juice, and you can hear him panting through the pain of like knowing that this is the person who's hurt him. And yet grace absolutely breaks through for me. Like, I just think it's such a beautiful moment, and I think that there's like, it's such a Flannery O'Connor moment to me. Like, I just think that moment is a really fantastic synthesizing of what she tries to do in her stories. And I think there are maybe other parts that I think maybe are less successful in that Flannery O'Connor line in the film, but this scene, to me, and the way that it builds up to this scene, is so strong in the way that it manages to utilize what Flannery O'Connor was always trying to do with Grace in her stories.
It's the essence of her characters, and she has a wonderful passage describing what makes her characters work. I often ask myself what makes a story work and what makes it hold up as a story, and I have decided that it's probably some action, some gesture of a character that is unlike any other in the story. One which indicates where the real heart of the story lies. This would have to be an action or a gesture which was totally right and totally unexpected. It would have to be one that was both in character and beyond character. It would have to suggest both the world and eternity. The action or gesture I'm talking about would have to be on the level which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it. It would be a gesture that transcends any neat allegory that might have been intended, or any pat moral category a reader could make. It would be a gesture which somehow made contact with mystery.
It's so good. She writes so eloquently, and I often say this, that if you're interested in Flannery O'Connor and you don't know where to start, I would say maybe some of her short stories, but almost as quickly as possible try and get to some of her non-fiction writing, her reflections and her letters and her essays, just because in some ways it is hard for us to access exactly what she's doing in her stories. And that when you start placing them within her very specific viewpoint, which is so well articulated and so thought out, that all starts falling into place. And I think this description here works so perfectly for a movie that's made, half a century later, and is trying to access the same thing that she's talking about there. And I think it's interesting that in some ways, for me and Michael, like, we both feel that it was such an obvious moment of grace and divine grace, because I think there is a way to view the film as not quite reaching that level, because there's a sort of ambiguity or a shaking off of the possibility of God, that there is kind of a question as to whether the film actually kind of needs to be a bit more explicitly Christian in order to work. Because, like I said, I think if you're going on it with the Flannery O'Connor view, you see it immediately. But maybe for people, I would say the vast majority of our audience won't have seen the split second at the start where someone's reading "A good man is hard to find." And even if they had, they mightn't know what that indicates, There is a sense that maybe there was more of a fully developed Christ, even just Christ-haunted element to the story.
Well, I think where some of it comes into is that the criticism is that, as I said here, we have Dixon's metamorphosis or kind of redemption is that he sees the victim that he threw out the window and is able to receive mercy from him. And because prior to this he's been painted as a racist, and very strongly so, and is a racist. But because the redemption didn't come from his racist actions, there is a kind of that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah.
And I can see where, kind of from wanting to balance the book's perspective, you might think that it would need to be addressed, and maybe it does still need to be. But from what the movie portrays, and I think from our understanding of God and grace, we aren't worthy of God's grace. So no matter of all the bad things that we've done, as long as we start to open the door to it, the rest is just washed away in the outpouring of redemption and of forgiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's the question. Like, if you're seeing this from a human point of view, redemption has to be earned, and it kind of has to be earned on all fronts, like you were saying, that you can't just have it in one direction. And like I said, that doesn't mean from a religious point of view, just because you've forgiven someone in one direction doesn't mean it's okay for you to be a racist. But it's more just the idea that you're opening yourself up to all of those things to be able to have that perspective, and also that we can also hope that God will see our efforts in one direction and grant us mercy in the areas that we may have failed to change and respond to his grace. That none of us can ever be fully redeemed on this earth, that there will always be things that we have blind spots for, or failings that we constantly fall into, or just things that we're not seeing about ourselves, and we do have to, at least on some level, rely on grace. And that doesn't mean that our sins are excusable. In some ways, the point is that Christ came to us while we were still sinners. They are sins. We are supposed to be better than them, but that divine grace can't be earned in the way that human redemption has to be. That on earth we have to earn our reconciliation with the world, but divine grace kind of supersedes all of that, and it can't be earned, and we can't put boundaries on it in the same way. And I think the point about Dixon that is important to keep in mind is that it's almost that he has to be vile enough for it to be a moment of worthy of divine grace, to see the extent to which Christ offers grace, that like the depths of humanity that he reaches out to. And I think there's this amazing, we've quoted her a lot, but we will continue to quote her, this unbelievable quote from Flannery O'Connor, which I think is so important, where she says, "There is something in us as storytellers and listeners to stories that demands the redemptive act, that demands that what falls at least be offered the chance to be restored. The reader of today looks for this motion, and rightly so, but what he has forgotten is the cost of it. His sense of evil is diluted or lacking altogether, and so he has forgotten the price of restoration. When he reads a novel, he wants either his sense tormented or his spirits raised. He wants to be transported instantly, either to mock damnation or a mock innocence." And what she's getting across there is that black and white view that you were talking about, that like he's either good or he's bad. He either atones for all of his wrongness or he atones for none of it. And I think the film is trying to say something a little bit more nuanced, or just that we haven't gotten the full story yet. We're looking at one moment of grace that we hope will be a mustard seed in his life.
Absolutely. And
I think what she also highlights in that quote is the cost of it, which is why the story needs to be violent. And we had an episode which I didn't actually re-listen to, so I can't quite remember what we had in it, but we had an episode way back at the start of the podcast on violence in films and why, as Catholics, just because a film is violent doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it can also often be a mechanism for telling a good story.
I'm sure the crucifixion is probably the most violent story. We nearly
yeah, exactly.
Man crucifying God.
Exactly. So, I mean, in some ways, Michael, you've just summed it up, that why do we need violence in stories? But I think Flannery O'Connor is a particularly good person to look to when we're talking about, like, why does this story need to be violent? And she's so good at showing how it needs to be violent because as a society we've so drifted away from what reality actually is. And when she talks about reality, it's like the spiritual reality, that we have no concept of the measure of our souls and the measure of our actions, because we're all in this, like you said, Michael, this cookie cutter, homogenized, nice respectability.
And that was 50 years ago or more. So like we've moved on even further from the point that Flannery was commenting on.
And that it's only something like violence that actually shocks us enough to start thinking about the eschatological things like death and the afterlife, what is beyond and what comes from beyond, that like we actually need something pretty grotesque and horrible to do that.
Very true.
And of course, she writes wonderfully about it. She has a quote, which I have here. Our age not only does not have a very sharp eye for the almost imperceptible intrusions of grace, it no longer has much feeling for the nature of the violence which precede and follow them. The devil's greatest wile, Baudelaire has said, is to convince us that he does not exist. I suppose the reasons for the use of so much violence in modern fiction will differ with each writer who uses it, but in my own stories I have found that violence is strangely capable of returning my characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moment of grace. Their heads are so hard that almost nothing else will work. And she also says that violence is a force which can be used for good or evil, and among other things, taken by it is the kingdom of heaven. She has this idea that you have to storm heaven, that it's something hard won, that it doesn't come from just, you know, cruising along nicely with nice respectability, I guess.
Absolutely. And to remember that Jesus himself used violent languages as well, like, you know, the Good Samaritan, you know, beaten and on the road, whereby everyone is moving away from him, the Levites and the priests, these religious men, they step aside from him, whereas it's the Samaritan that comes up close, gets in with the wounds and the messiness of of life, and that's where his salvation has been won, is engaging in that work.
That's such a good point that I hadn't even necessarily associated with, which is how violent so many of the parables are, and that it would have been shocking to his audience as well to hear this story of this man beaten on the side of the road. That's the point of that story is that that's the figure you avert your eyes from because you don't want to see it.
Exactly.
And that also that in some ways violence in some capacity is necessary for change. And when I say violence, like even in a small way, you have to kill the parts of yourself that need to be shed in order to grow and change. And it, you know, that can feel like a very quiet, silent thing that happens inside of yourself, but it is, you know, something on a profoundly theological level, a kind of violence of stripping away the sin and stripping away the crutches that you lean on that hide you from and protect you from encountering Christ. That change is painful. She talks about that a lot as well. And I think it's so interesting in terms of a modern age, because there's so much of modernity which is about coddling us and giving us sort of affirmative messages, and that it's about not encountering the truth. And so I think it's kind of telling that Three Billboards is so based on advertising, like this advertising space, like using a space that should be for, I don't know, selling hair wax or whatever it was, that like is now attempting to be used to tell the truth.
And I think that's Flannery summarizes that beautifully with her quote on the truth does not change with our ability to stomach it. You know, in the sense that so often we ignore the truth because it's just unpalatable, that to look at it and sit with it for a while, it just nauseates us, and so it's better to tell us false tales than to live with it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really perfect, because she has these great quotes about saying that goodness is quite ugly. She says that Most of us have learned to be dispassionate about evil, to look it in the face and find as often as not our own grinning reflections with which we do not argue. But good is another matter. Few have stared at that long enough to accept that its face too is grotesque, that in us the good is something under construction. The modes of evil usually receive worthy expression. The modes of good have to be satisfied with a cliche or a smoothing down that will soften their real look. I think that word cliche is so actually prescient. Like in the film, there's this whole plot point at the end which is about a cliche that somebody reads on a bookmark, which is anger begets greater anger. And so all of the goodness that that can be said in the film is summed up on this silly bookmark, because that's kind of all that's left to it. Whereas the billboards are trying to express some kind of truth and good, and it's kind of not quite reaching its ability. And you know, there's that kind of brokenness in terms of the modern ability to transmit good, like the fact that advertising is this kind of modern fixture that is everywhere and that we can't quite utilize for good.
I think it's not that I would stumble and go as far as say that the billboards are trying to say truth, in that they are definitely a call for help and a call for attention. And there's nothing wrong. There is no, in the words of truth, yes, she states fact about her daughter's death, that there hasn't been any arrests, and asks the question of the chief, why is that? So definitely there is no false statement with those statements. But it doesn't, so often, I suppose, and this may be the problem with kind of social media and Twitter and stuff, where we try to reduce down complex issues to bite-size pieces that are kind of catchy or clickbaity, that we lose the essence and the enormity and the complexity that is behind these meanings, and so much so that we only focus on the words, and even then it's so easy then to twist and manipulate them.
Yeah, and I think that kind of clickbaitiness is telling. Like you said, it's about trying to distill things down into something that is easily transmittable. And, that our modern institutions really struggle with this. The way that we've constructed society, it doesn't lend itself to grotesque and ugly truth or goodness, that it has to be this kind of clean, polished marketing version, that like this advertising friendly version of truth, or this advertising friendly version of even like religion or Christ or anything like that. And there's this great line where she's in the film where Mildred is being sarcastic, but she says, "Wow, when you can't trust the lawyers and the advertising men, what the hell's America coming to, huh?" And it's so cutting and funny. And, that the idea that these are the remnants of justice and truth and goodness that are left to us.
But they are the only instruments that she has, in the sense that she can't go to the police. She knows them to be corrupt, and she's forsaken the church, which she has long since not gone to. So for her, when she's kind of cut off these kind of sources of what should be supported, and rightly and wrongfully, the way...
Yeah, that like she has seen actual failures in both of those institutions, that she has been let down by them in very real ways. Yeah. Exactly.
And so the only way that she can get her voice across is through kind of the media and the advertising and having to go to the lawyers and trying to use them as her weapons. And I think it's kind of telling then that she does use good reasons for kind of using this medium, whereby she says that the best chance of her getting this case solved is keeping it in the public eye and keeping it alive in that way. And so it is logical, it is truth, but breaking it down into that bite-sized chunk, it just doesn't convey the wealth of emotion.
Yeah, I think that's it. And so I think it's also a testament to the need for your own clarity and the need for that serious moral vision that Flannery O'Connor has, that we do really struggle in this modern age to communicate with truth and clarity, and also to find grace and to experience that kind of redemptive grace that she talks about, because it is like everything is set up to try and avoid it as much as possible because it's very uncomfortable. And so I think that's why both of us really liked this movie so much, is just because it's so interesting in the way that it is actually genuinely trying to look at what does it mean to be redeemed and what does grace look like in this kind of society. And I think for both of us, we thought it for us at least, it was successful. And I think for even people who see it not being as successful as maybe a Flannery O'Connor, I think the fact that it is really wrestling with it is very noteworthy, and I think there's a lot to get out of it.
And it's also so entertaining. I mean, I've watched deep, impactful movies, and yes, you feel gutted afterwards, but it's not a pleasant watch, and you certainly don't feel like you want to go through it again. Whereas this, with the humour, it's very dark humour, but at the same time, it keeps the story rolling along nicely, and you're engaged and more than happy to kind of go watch again. And in fact, the ending of it, you want to stay longer with these characters because you've grown close to them. You want to kind of see them, whatever happens, even though it's a mystery of what happens at the end or how is it going to end. You've become their friends in some ways. You want to walk with them further along their paths, their respective paths, and hopefully that path is to redemption.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to shout out also the music in it is fantastic. So it's just, and it's beautifully made. The cinematography is great. It's just a really well constructed film, and we both really liked it. So now that we've covered that we like Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, what else are you enjoying at the moment, Michael?
Well, I suppose keeping on kind of the theme of Flannery O'Connor and kind of the intrusiveness of grace, I'm at the moment I'm watching Breaking Bad.
A little late to the game.
Oh, very late to the game. I mean, I studied chemistry when I was in college, and pretty much everyone's saying, "Oh, have you seen Breaking Bad yet?" And I had never actually watched it.
I feel like this is exactly like when I did my master's on dragons and for my master's in Viking and Anglo-Saxon studies, and literally the only thing anyone ever asked me was, "Oh, are you watching Game of Thrones?" Which I wasn't. So you and I had the same experience.
Exactly. And I haven't come to the end. I'm only halfway through the second season, so I can't say, but so far really enjoying it. Of course, again, caveating, it's very much R-rated, lots of heavy drug use, lots of violence, and then there's even stuff in it that, you know, I do question the legitimacy of the narrative and like how useful it is. Like there's sex scenes which are clearly introduced just to create a reaction from the audience, etc. So it's not by any means a perfect, or it's not without nuance. But at the same time, it deals a lot with this kind of themes of Flannery, whereby you're presented with these grotesque characters, and very much from the get-go, you see the seeds of their own ruin being planted within them, and the various paths of that they're going down, and their own demise as being, in some ways, it's kind of Shakespearean tragedy. They're reaping their own rewards. But at the same time, there is that grace that is trying to break through, and that they never actually fully reduce the characters to just simply good and bad. That these characters, and I suppose just for your audience don't know, it's about a chemistry teacher who has been given a diagnosis of terminal cancer, and with mounting bills to pay, medical bills particularly, he turns to making meth to try and subsidize that, the medical bills. So like that, it starts off from a kind of a position whereby he is really in a corner. He's very a tragic character in many respects. But then it's these first rumblings of stones of kind of what started out maybe as a necessarily evil. He definitely aspires. He's offered chances of redemption, of faith, and keeps on spurring it because he wants more, and he's kind of blinded then to his to the kind of the path that he's going, or just at least not caring about the ramifications of what he's doing.
Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely one that I know people are sort of aghast when I say I haven't seen it. I'm sure I will get there at some point, but yeah, it does sound fascinating. And since we're on a kind of theme of maybe like things you wouldn't necessarily expect from a podcast on beauty and Catholic art and all of those things, I'll just be honest, the thing I was enjoying is I went to the Machine Gun Kelly concert yesterday, and I had a great time. I referenced this on a podcast before. I totally accept that it's not maybe the most elevated of my particular musical choices, but I had a great time. I loved it. I always think it's so funny. I feel like when people, if I'm talking to my friends, I feel like from the Catholic point of view, people might be a little bit like, oh, that's not, I guess, wholesome or uplifting enough. And then from my music friends, they might be like, oh, that's too basic, or that's not that's not musically interesting enough. But I had a great time. It was a great gig. It was a big show, and it's just really nice after a couple of years of not getting to go to concerts to get to go to one with a whole
lot of energy.
Yeah, a lot of energy, a big crowd, scream some great lyrics, and have a great time. So that's what I was enjoying at the moment. I will note it's what we're enjoying at the moment. It's not necessarily a recommendation for everyone. So I'll just be honest about what I'm enjoying at the moment. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode. We'll have it slightly Halloween-y themed for the season. And otherwise, you can catch us on Twitter. I'm at this handle @SeekingWatson, and the podcast is on Instagram at Risking Enchantment Podcast. You can also find it on my website, rachelsherlock.com, where you can sign up for the newsletter to get an email whenever we have a new episode of the podcast. And thank you very much for joining me this evening, Michael.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Goodbye. This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.